Elon Musk's AI Grok, built by his company XAI, has become known for tackling questions other chatbots tend to sidestep: politics, science, philosophy, and increasingly, the history of religion itself. Recently, researchers testing how far its reasoning could go asked it something most Western Christians have never had reason to ask, because most Western Christians don't even know the question exists. What does the Bible actually contain once you stop assuming there's only one version of it? Not the King James translation, not the Catholic canon, not the Protestant 66 books most people in America, Britain, or Australia grew up with. The Ethiopian Bible, the scripture of the oldest continuously practicing Christian nation on earth. A canon that runs to 81 books, sometimes counted as 88 depending on how the collection is organized, versus the 66 most Western readers have ever held in their hands. What Grok surfaced when it was asked to walk through that difference wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a documented, centuries-old story that most of Christianity simply stopped telling. And once you understand how those extra books disappeared from the version of the Bible most of the world reads, and why one small, mountainous, never colonized African nation kept them anyway, it becomes very hard to think about the Bible the same way again. Most people assume the Bible is a fixed, unchanging object. It's the same 66 books in every church, on every shelf, in every language, everywhere in the world. That assumption is wrong, and it's been wrong for most of Christian history. There's never been a single, universally agreed upon table of contents for the Bible. Catholic Bibles include books that Protestant Bibles leave out, a set of texts called the Deuterocanonical books or the Apocrypha, works like Tobit, Judith, and Maccabees. 7 additional books that Protestant reformers removed in the 16th century because they wanted to align scripture with the Hebrew canon used by Jewish communities at the time. Eastern Orthodox Bibles differ again, including a handful of texts that neither Catholic nor Protestant Bibles carry. But of every major surviving Christian tradition on earth, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church holds by a wide margin the largest biblical canon in continuous use. And the reason for that gap isn't accidental. It's the direct result of one of the most consequential and least discussed decisions in the entire history of the Christian faith. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning of Christianity in Ethiopia. Because unlike almost every other region that eventually became Christian, Ethiopia didn't receive the religion, secondhand through European missionaries arriving centuries later with colonial ambitions attached. It got there almost immediately, independently, and by its own account, directly. Ethiopian church tradition traces its spiritual lineage back to the Queen of Sheba and her legendary meeting with King Solomon described in the book of 1 Kings, and to a son the tradition holds, she bore him named Menelik. Whatever the historical reality behind that specific legend, the deeper claim that Ethiopia's connection to the biblical world long predates Christianity itself has real weight because Ethiopia and the kingdoms of ancient Israel had documented trade and cultural contact going back well over 2,000 years. Christianity itself arrived formally in Ethiopia in the 4th century through a genuinely remarkable historical accident. A Syrian Christian named Frumentius, shipwrecked as a young man on the Red Sea, coast ended up in the royal court of the Kingdom of Axum, the powerful trading empire that then controlled much of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Over time, Frumentius gained enough trust and influence within the royal household that he eventually converted King Ezana, the ruling monarch of Axum, to Christianity. This wasn't some minor regional development. Axum was, at that point, one of the major powers of the ancient world, mentioned by Persian sources alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 great kingdoms on earth. His conversion happened around the year 330, which places Ethiopia's formal Christianization within a decade or two of the Roman Empire's own under Constantine. Ethiopia wasn't a Christian latecomer. It was one of the very first nations on earth to adopt Christianity as a state religion, doing so independently, without Rome's involvement, and without ever passing through the Roman Empire's political or theological control structure. That last detail turns out to matter enormously because it explains almost everything that follows. While Christianity in Europe and the Mediterranean world developed under the umbrella and eventually the authority of Rome and later Constantinople, Ethiopia developed its own distinct church, geographically isolated by mountains, deserts, and later by the rapid 7th century expansion of Islam across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which effectively cut Ethiopian Christianity off from most direct contact with the rest of the Christian world for well over 1,000 years. Ethiopia became, in a very real sense, an island, Christian, ancient, and almost completely isolated from the theological and political battles that would go on to reshape Western Christianity again and again over the following centuries. That isolation is the single biggest reason Ethiopia's Bible looks so different from everyone else's. because while European and Mediterranean Christianity was going through a long, complicated, multi-century process of deciding exactly which books counted as scripture, a process that unfolded gradually through the 4th and 5th centuries, and honestly was never fully finished in the same way across every branch of the faith, Ethiopia was already operating with its own well-established set of sacred texts. And it simply never got the memo about the later Western consensus because there was no political or ecclesiastical mechanism connecting the two churches closely enough for that memo to arrive. So what exactly is sitting in the Ethiopian canon that isn't in a typical Western Bible? The single most famous and most historically significant example is the Book of Enoch. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the Book of Enoch isn't some obscure text nobody in early Christianity cared about. It's quoted directly by name in the New Testament itself, in the short letter of Jude, which cites Enoch prophesying about the coming judgment of the ungodly. Multiple early church fathers, including Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, treated Enoch as legitimate inspired scripture. Fragments of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, proving it was an active religious use among Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. And yet, by the 4th and 5th centuries, as the Western canon solidified, Enoch was quietly left out, eventually falling almost entirely out of circulation across most of the Christian and Jewish world for well over 1,000 years, except in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church never dropped it. Enoch remained part of the actively used, actively copied Ethiopian biblical canon continuously, generation after generation, monastery after monastery, for the entire span of time that the rest of the world had essentially lost it. And that continuity produced one of the more remarkable moments in the modern rediscovery of ancient texts. For centuries, European scholars knew Enoch had existed because it was quoted by ancient authors, but they had no complete surviving copy. Anywhere in Europe or the Middle East, the book was effectively presumed lost. Then, in the 1770s, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce, traveling through Ethiopia searching for the source of the Blue Nile, brought back complete Ethiopian manuscript copies of the Book of Enoch, preserved in the ancient liturgical language Ge'ez, the same language Ethiopian scripture has been copied in for over 2,500 years. It took European scholars until the early 19th century to actually translate and publish it. But when they did, it confirmed something remarkable. The version of Enoch that had supposedly vanished from history had never actually vanished. It had simply been sitting in Ethiopian monasteries the entire time, copied faithfully by monks who had no idea the rest of Christendom had lost track of it. Enoch itself is worth pausing on because its content explains a great deal about why it makes some theological traditions uncomfortable. The book describes, in detailed, vivid narrative, a group of rebellious angels called the Watchers who descend to Earth, take human wives, and teach humanity forbidden knowledge, including metallurgy, weapon-making, and various forms of magic and divination, corrupting the world so severely that it becomes one of the central justifications given for the flood in the Genesis account. This narrative provides a far more elaborate origin story for evil and corruption on Earth than anything explicitly spelled out in the Genesis text itself, which only briefly and cryptically mentions the sons of God taking human wives in a single strange, compressed passage in chapter 6. Enoch expands that single sentence into an entire mythological framework. And scholars widely agree this expanded story shaped a huge amount of Jewish and early Christian thinking about the nature of evil, fallen angels, and the origins of demonic influence in the world, even after the book itself stopped being formally read as scripture in most of Christianity. The Ethiopian canon doesn't stop with Enoch. It also preserves the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Little Genesis, a retelling and expansion of the Book of Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus, organized around a detailed calendar system and filled with additional narrative material not found in the standard biblical text. Like Enoch, Jubilees was known and used by early Jewish communities, confirmed by fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unlike Enoch, it eventually dropped out of the mainstream Jewish and Christian canon everywhere except Ethiopia, where it remained continuously part of the sacred text tradition. Beyond these two well-known examples, the broader Ethiopian canon includes a range of other texts rarely encountered by Western readers. Among them, the Book of the Covenant, a work traditionally associated with post-resurrection teaching material and various additional psalms, historical books, and texts associated with figures like Baruch. Texts that circulated more widely in the ancient world than most modern readers realize, before narrowing canonical traditions elsewhere gradually excluded them. So the natural question becomes, why did the rest of Christianity let these books go? This is where the story moves from historical curiosity into something with real theological and political weight. And it's worth being precise about it because there's a difference between what actually happened historically and the more dramatic conspiracy version. of events that sometimes circulates online. There was never one single dramatic meeting where church authorities voted to ban the Book of Enoch and burn every copy. What actually happened was slower, messier, and in some ways more interesting. A gradual, centuries-long process of canon formation shaped by several overlapping factors. The first factor was a growing preference, especially among influential 4th and 5th century theologians like Jerome the Scholar, responsible for translating the Bible into Latin, for aligning the Old Testament canon specifically with the Hebrew scriptures, as they were being used by Jewish religious authorities of that era, rather than with the broader collection of texts that had been circulating more loosely in Greek-speaking Jewish and early Christian communities for centuries. Jerome was famously skeptical of several of these additional books, and his preferences carried enormous weight given his central role in producing the Latin Vulgate, the translation that would go on to dominate Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. The second factor was theological discomfort. Books like Enoch, with its elaborate stories of fallen angels intermarrying with humans and generating monstrous offspring, made a number of influential early theologians genuinely uneasy, both because the material felt increasingly strange and mythological to audiences shaped by more philosophically rigorous Greek theological training, and because some church leaders worried the book's vivid, detailed cosmology gave too much narrative authority to a text that wasn't, in their view, on the same footing as the core Torah and prophetic writings. The third factor, and the one Ethiopian and diaspora scholars have argued deserves far more attention than it typically receives, is institutional and political. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the early 4th century, and as church structure became increasingly centralized, standardized, and tied to imperial authority, there was a genuine institutional incentive toward theological uniformity. A single, clearly defined, defensible canon was simply easier to teach, easier to defend against rival interpretations, and easier to enforce across an empire trying to unify a previously fragmented, regionally diverse religious landscape. Texts that were ambiguous, strange, regionally inconsistent in their use, or theologically complicated, were natural casualties of that broader push toward standardization, regardless of how genuinely popular or historically significant they had been in earlier generations. None of that process, importantly, ever touched Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was never part of the Roman Empire, never fell under the authority of the Bishop of Rome, or later the Patriarch of Constantinople in any binding way, and after the 7th century Islamic expansion across the region, became almost entirely cut off from regular contact with the rest of the Christian world for the better part of a millennium. Whatever canon Ethiopia had settled into by the time that isolation set in is essentially the canon it kept, preserved not through defiance of a decision made elsewhere, but simply because the decision made elsewhere never had the chance to reach it and take hold. The physical preservation of these texts is itself one of the more remarkable stories in the entire history of religious scholarship. Ethiopian Christianity produced and continues to maintain an extraordinary monastic manuscript tradition centered on places most Western audiences have never heard of. Lalibela, a complex of 11 medieval churches in the Ethiopian highlands, was carved directly downward out of solid volcanic rock, then built upward out of stone blocks, so that each church is essentially sculpted as a single monolithic structure below ground level, connected by a network of tunnels and trenches. Constructed roughly in the 12th and 13th centuries under King Lalibela, these churches remain active places of worship today, not museum pieces, still filled with priests, still holding regular liturgy, still surrounded by pilgrims. Then there's Aksum, the ancient capital of the kingdom that first adopted Christianity in the 4th century, home to a church that Ethiopian tradition holds contains the actual Ark of the Covenant, guarded continuously by a single designated monk who, according to tradition, never leaves the chapel grounds for the rest of his life once he takes on the role, with no outsider permitted to view the object directly. Whether or not the object housed there is what tradition claims it to be is a question no outside historian has ever been allowed to verify, since access is restricted entirely to that one guardian. But the tradition itself and the seriousness with which it's maintained have been documented by travelers and scholars for centuries, throughout monasteries scattered across the Ethiopian highlands and places with minimal modern infrastructure. Monks have spent over 1,000 years hand-copying manuscripts in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity, a language that stopped being spoken as an everyday tongue centuries ago, but never stopped being used for scripture and worship. It functions today somewhat the way Latin functioned in the Catholic Church for centuries after ordinary people stopped speaking it in daily life. Institutions like the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in the United States have spent decades working to digitally photograph and preserve tens of thousands of these manuscripts, many of them centuries old, some surviving in only a single known copy anywhere on Earth. A preservation effort. Scholars consider urgent, given the fragility of the physical manuscripts and the political instability that has periodically threatened the regions where they are kept. There's a broader historical pattern worth sitting with here, too, because Ethiopia's religious independence and its political independence turn out to be deeply intertwined. Ethiopia is one of only two African nations, alongside Liberia, that was never formally colonized by a European power, successfully repelling an Italian invasion attempt at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. A victory that stunned European colonial powers became a lasting symbol of African resistance to colonization. That same pattern of resistance to outside control that kept Ethiopia politically independent also kept its religious tradition independent, uninterrupted by the kind of colonial-era missionary activity that reshaped Christian practice and often Christian scripture itself across huge portions of the rest of Africa and the world during the 19th and 20th centuries. There's also a fascinating linguistic and manuscript detail that specialists in the field consider one of the strongest arguments for taking the Ethiopian textual tradition seriously as a source of genuinely ancient material, rather than dismissing it as a later regional oddity. In several cases, including the Book of Enoch, the complete Ethiopian Ge'ez, turns out to align remarkably closely with the much older fragmentary Aramaic and Hebrew versions found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century, manuscripts that had been sealed in desert caves since roughly the 1st century before Christ and were completely unknown to anyone anywhere, including Ethiopian monks, until their rediscovery in 1947. That alignment matters enormously because it means the Ethiopian textual tradition wasn't drifting or inventing new material over the centuries. It was faithfully preserving something extremely close to what religious communities in 1st century Judea were actually reading, entirely independent of any contact between Ethiopia and the Dead Sea region. Two separate preservation traditions, one in the deserts of Judea, sealed away and untouched for 2,000 years, one in the mountains of Ethiopia, actively copied and recopied for the same 2,000 years, arriving at strikingly similar textual content. This is treated by manuscript scholars as strong evidence that both traditions were transmitting something genuinely old and genuinely stable, not something invented or altered along the way. It's also worth clearing up a detail that trips up almost everyone encountering this topic for the first time, because even the number of books in the Ethiopian canon isn't as simple as a single, fixed figure. Ethiopian tradition itself distinguishes between what's sometimes called the narrower canon, numbering around 81 books, and a broader canon that can run higher depending on how certain multi-part texts are counted. Whether books like the 4 books traditionally attributed to the Synodos, a collection of early church order and liturgical material, are counted as one work or several, and how various smaller texts get grouped or separated in different manuscript traditions. This isn't evidence of some vague, uncertain, made-up scripture. It reflects something closer to how complex centuries-old library systems naturally develop different cataloging conventions in different regions and different eras. Even within the New Testament portion of the Ethiopian canon, there's a broader tradition that includes additional works beyond the 27 books found in every other Christian tradition, including texts related to church order and discipline that were treated as authoritative guidance for church life in Ethiopia long after similar. Material had stopped being read as scripture almost everywhere else. Modern scholarship on all of this has accelerated substantially over the past several decades, and it's worth being clear about how that scholarship actually happens because it isn't mysterious or hidden. Institutions like the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, along with university programs in Ethiopian and Eritrean studies at places including Hamburg, Naples, and various American and European research centers, have spent recent decades systematically cataloging, digitizing, and cross-referencing thousands of Ethiopian manuscripts, many held in monasteries that had never before been surveyed by outside researchers. This work is slow, technical, and largely invisible to the public, involving careful paleographic dating, comparison of scribal hands across centuries, and painstaking translation of a liturgical language most people, including most modern Ethiopians, no longer read fluently. It's the opposite of a dramatic sudden revelation. It's decades of patient cataloging work finally reaching a point where enough material has been digitized and cross-referenced that broader patterns, like the striking overlap between Ethiopian Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, could even be identified and confirmed in the first place. There's one more thread worth pulling on because it shows just how deep Ethiopia's distinct religious identity actually runs beyond just an expanded biblical canon. Ethiopia is also home to one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, the Beta Israel, sometimes historically referred to by the term Falasha, a community whose own traditions claim ancient roots tied to the same Solomon and Sheba lineage that Ethiopian Christian tradition draws on. Whatever the precise historical origins of that community, and scholars continue to debate the details, Its long independent existence alongside Ethiopian Christianity reinforces the same underlying pattern found throughout the story. Ethiopia sat at a genuine crossroads of the ancient biblical world, absorbing and preserving religious traditions with a continuity that simply has no real parallel anywhere else on earth, Christian or Jewish, because it was never fully swept up into the empires, councils, and reform movements that reshaped religious practice almost everywhere else. Those traditions survived in forms that elsewhere gradually disappeared. This doesn't mean the Ethiopian canon represents some secret, hidden, more authentic version of Christianity that the rest of the world was deliberately blinded to through a single coordinated act of suppression. The real history is more nuanced and, honestly, more interesting than that. What it does mean is that the assumption most Western Christians carry that the Bible has always had a single, fixed, universally agreed table of contents simply isn't accurate and hasn't ever been accurate. Canon formation was a long, gradual, regionally uneven process shaped by theology, politics, geography, and access to manuscripts, playing out differently in different parts of the Christian world. And Ethiopia represents the clearest surviving example of what an early, geographically isolated Christian tradition looked like before that broader Western standardization process ever reached it. There's also a specific, well-documented irony sitting at the heart of the Book of Enoch's history that's worth spelling out plainly because it captures the whole story in miniature. For roughly 1,000 years, the majority of Christian and Jewish scholars across Europe and the Middle East operated on the assumption that Enoch was simply gone, a text known only through secondhand quotations and other ancient writings. Its actual content was permanently lost to history. Entire theological traditions developed and calcified around that assumption of loss. And the entire time that assumption held, the complete text sat fully intact in regular liturgical use in a country most of those same scholars could not have located on a map. When Bruce brought his manuscripts back to Europe in the 1770s, the initial reaction from parts of the European scholarly establishment wasn't unified excitement. Some scholars were openly skeptical that an African manuscript tradition could have preserved something so significant so faithfully, a skepticism that delayed serious translation and study for decades, and that later generations of scholars have been fairly candid about attributing, at least in part, to the same broader assumptions about whose religious and intellectual traditions counted as reliable that shaped so much of European scholarship during that era. It eventually took until the early 19th century when the English scholar Richard Lawrence produced the first full English translation for the wider Western academic world to seriously reckon with what Ethiopia had been holding on to the entire time. And it took until the 20th century discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments for that Ethiopian preservation to receive the kind of independent, cross-checked validation that finally put any remaining scholarly doubt to rest. It's not the story of a secret book that was deliberately hidden from humanity. It's the fact that an entire alternate branch of the Christian textual tradition has been sitting in plain sight, actively practiced by tens of millions of people for well over 1,000 years, largely unknown outside specialist academic circles. Not because anyone hid it, but because most of the Western world simply never had a reason to go looking. The monks of Lalibela and Aksum weren't trying to smuggle forbidden knowledge past the authorities. They were doing what monks in isolated communities everywhere have always done, faithfully copying what they'd inherited, generation after generation, without any particular awareness that the rest of the Christian world had taken a different path. That raises a real unresolved question that scholars themselves continue to debate. If canon formation was this uneven, this shaped by politics and geography and access, rather than by some single, clean, universally agreed process, what does that actually tell us about how Scripture itself came together? It doesn't necessarily mean any particular excluded book should be read as equally authoritative to the books that made it into the standard Western canon. Serious textual scholars, including specialists who study the Ethiopian tradition closely, still weigh these texts with real critical distance, asking hard questions about dating, authorship, and theological consistency, the same way they would with any ancient religious document. But it does mean the story most people were taught, that the Bible arrived essentially complete and settled from the very beginning, was never quite true, and that one small, mountainous, historically isolated nation has been quietly holding on to a fuller, older, more complicated version of that story the entire time, waiting, it turns out, not for suppression to end, but simply for the rest of the world to finally start paying attention.